So, welcome everyone. Glad to be here with Kat today to talk about how we are leveraging threat intelligence for attack evaluations with this wonderful title talk that Kat provided, which is Kittens and Pandas and Bears, but why? So, a little bit to start with who I am and who Kat is to start off this talk, since it's the first time you've heard from us today, and you'll hear from a lot of the people multiple times. But I am the general manager for the Attack Evaluations program. Been at MITRE for my entire career since I was an intern back from my days at Syracuse, doing a wide variety of things from radar signal processing up through blue teaming to adversary emulation, working on developing the program, what it means at MITRE, and then eventually the attack evaluations program. And that's kind of like the three parts to my career. Kat, do you want to provide a quick introduction for yourself?
Yes. So my name is Cat Self. I work as the CTI lead on attack evaluations, and I also spend time as the macOS lead on attack enterprise, macOS and Linux. Previously, I worked at Target, where I was given the opportunity to be a software developer. We worked a lot on behavioral analytics regarding the organization and their security posture as a whole. Then I transitioned to being a red teamer, an internal red teamer, and then a threat hunter at Target. And prior to that, I was a military intelligence veteran. So lots of fun there. But we're super excited to have you here today. And hopefully you enjoy the title, Lions and Tigers and Bears, but kittens and pandas.
It's all good, and you'll get that theme pretty shortly here. And both Kat and I obviously have referenced attack evaluations, which I know Rich brought up in his keynote as well. But really, where we're applying threat informed defense to our practice is using adversary emulation to assess product capability. So being able to say what they can truly do against known adversaries. So why attack evaluations matter? It's really real world, and it's because we do center it around threat intelligence. It's all publicly sourced threat intelligence. Occasionally we'll do a open call for contributions around specific threat actors, and we'll get into what I mean by that in a little while. But we want to make sure that we are not just tilting at windmills, that we're actually being threat informed in our evaluation, saying what products can do in regards to the threat. We also want it to be accessible. So we do the same test for every participant. It's all heavily scripted. It is humans that are acting it, but it's a script that we use to run our evaluation. And you can find a very similar script in the Center for Threat Informed Defense Adversary Emulation Plan library. You can find what we transmit our emulation plans into that format at the end to hopefully provide some public value as well. And it's transparent, right? We release that methodology at the end. We have transparent results. It's all about being open and honest about what we do, explain our rationale for doing it, source back to threat intelligence through every aspect of it. And that way we can ensure that it's addressing the threat and being truly threat informed. But as we enter into this world of a Wizard of Oz themed talk, let's not look too far behind the curtain here. Why adversary emulation? Right? We want to provide our story of villain. We want to provide that thing that people can look at, that story around it, right? Just like Oz had his curtain. He has that vision. We want to give people that vision to latch onto. It makes it real, as I already said, right? Ensuring that we're not just going off and dealing with prospective threats when we can't even handle today's threat. Let's make it something that we can actually do. Make it repeatable and measurable. We can run the same methodology over and over again and get different results, right? We can emulate in our range, provide baseline data for how products perform, but then we can also give you that methodology so you can run it in your own environment and get your own customized results and see how that changes. And it also gives us a lot of control over experimental design. So it provides a very structured way of understanding how techniques would be used, right? It's not just picking random techniques off the map or trying to somehow figure out how we could accommodate every technique, as much as that would be great. Instead, it gives us a very logical subset to act on. So around every corner, there's threats that we have to be alarmed with, right? I'm thinking about like how Dorothy is going along the line saying, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, right? And that's really what this comes to. It's as a defender, there's threats all around. How do I know which one matters for me? How do I know even where to start from this threat informed defense perspective? Every day, another threat's being named, and it's whatever is the hottest threat of the week, right? It's always changing, and marketing doesn't help with this, right? Now everybody's using it as marketing advantage to be able to say, "Oh, this threat is amazing, and our team is even more amazing for finding it out and finding out the latest techniques that it's using." At the end of the day, does that threat even matter to you? It's really hard, and from an organizational standpoint, to understand, is this something that I need to care about? And so there's always the question of where to start. How do I define which threats matter to me? So, from my organizational standpoint, I can drive organizational improvement. I can know that my security is going to work when I need it to work against who is likely to attack my organization. So, I wanted to kind of give some insights with this talk on how attack evaluations approaches this problem, because it's not like we pick adversaries out of thin air. um, well, maybe we do in the past. Kat's trying to change that, as she'll go into. But there is a lot of logic to trying to figure out which threats can appropriately validate your defenses. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about why we pick different adversaries through the years, at least at a high level, and then we can zoom into a more rigorous way of choosing them when Kat gets to talking. But if we look at attack evaluations through years, we consistently use adversary emulation. And before I get to the specific actors, I guess it would make sense for me to talk about what we do from that high level. So we use adversary emulation, which, I mean, it's the theme of the day. I won't regurgitate what that is. But what we want to do is pick threats that will allow us to evaluate these technologies, um, and provide insights to what they can do, but also to level them up, right? It's always this balance of trying to being fair to the vendors in terms of showcasing what they can do today, but also trying to push them for tomorrow. And it's a hard balance to sometimes deal with. But what we tried to do by laying out these adversaries that we select for a given round is try to put some logic behind that. And so APT3 was our first one that we did. So why APT3? Well, really, it was our baseline. They do a lot of living off the land techniques, things that should be identifiable when you considered just process detection. So, like, you see a process start, see the command line arguments, you can do pretty well, especially in the first scenario that we had for APT3, just because at the time they were doing a lot of stuff that was just in plain sight, right? It was things that should be detectable by the EDR market at the time. Now, I say that it should be because the EDR market, when we started, was this new thing, right? When you're thinking back to 2018, or even 2017, when we were announcing, right, that these technologies were new. They were trying to figure out how to do stuff. So I thought it would be very good to provide a baseline understanding of, can these capabilities detect just like the most basic of information, those command line arguments. And even today, when you look at attack, that's the most common data source for detecting attacks. So it's highly important. So we did that, but then we thought, you know what? One of the challenges to attack is that techniques have variation, right? You can't just paint a broad brush and say, I am covered for this technique under all circumstances. This was slightly mitigated when you start talking about attack evolving with sub techniques. But at the same time, it still has a certain amount of that lack of procedural context when you're talking about attack techniques. And so what we thought is, let's take what APT3 had done, but then let's try to show an evolution of it and use something like PowerShell. Now, at the time, APT3 wasn't using PowerShell. I recognize that this is a CTI deviation. It's one that we made purposefully. And when you hear the mad content around adversary emulation, I think that Michael hits on some of these points himself. But what we wanted to do was show that, you know what, there's different ways of executing the same attack techniques. And in some cases, a vendor might be able to detect something, and in some cases, a vendor might not be able to detect something. You can't just paint one execution, it detected it as I am secure, and instead show some of this evolution. And what we actually found was that, you know what, PowerShell, which back in 2018 was more or less a novel technique that adversaries were just starting to use, that defenders were just starting to talk about, PowerShell is this big gaping hole in defensive capabilities. EDR solutions didn't know how to collect the data, how to process the data, and how to make it useful to consumers. So what we saw was that it had very poor defensive coverage when we talked about things like PowerShell scripting. So there was a step, I think it was 12E5 or something like that, if you go back through our data, where vendors just did not cover it. There's, I think, maybe one or two vendors that did once we released the methodology and we were going to do what we called rolling admissions at the time, which we don't do anymore. But in general, everybody that came in blind to that test wasn't able to provide that detection. So you know what we did? Well, the next round we did all PowerShell and focused entirely on it. That was to note that, you know what, let's pick a really sophisticated adversary in APT29 that does a lot of advanced techniques. It does things like defense evasion and those types of actions, but they do so much in PowerShell. So let's focus on that. Let's drive in and see how vendors are now advancing their capability. Again, PowerShell between 2018 and 2019, when this was happening, when we were designing this, it was one of those things we knew we had to try to do our part to try to level up the community and being able to understand detections around PowerShell. And it was a mixed bag, but largely speaking, the detection rates for PowerShell went way up. People were collecting the data at least. Now, I will say that PowerShell script block logging is hardly data that's usable. So it still comes down to your use may vary, but it was really good to see vendors going from maybe like 1 out of 12 to over 90% being able to detect it between the two different rounds. So we saw that evolved growth by being able to select an adversary that would really push the state of the market forward. And that's part of the goal for the attack evaluations program. So now let's fast forward to the results that we released this past April, which was Carbonac and Fin7. So the most recently completed attack evaluations for enterprise round. And here, what we wanted to do was get away from these nation state actors, right? APT3 was associated with China, APT29 Russia. We wanted to do something that would have broad public impact, something that wasn't just based on intellectual property theft or anything like that. Let's spice it up a little bit and get something that would really drive to public impact. And so we decided to go with, at the time, one of the most known or most publicized actors that was out there, which was Fin7. There's a lot of threat intel available based on the Nick Cars of the world and a number of other people that were providing a lot of information on what this actor does in the public space. And so we knew that there would be this ripe amount of intel to pull from to create an authentic adversary emulation, because at the end of the day, we hold a very high bar to what our adversary emulation is. But as we were developing, we realized, you know what, Fin7 is a really messy group. Is it Fin7? Is it Carbonac? Is it Carbonac group? Some people were calling it Carbonac because of the malware. Some of them were doing it as a threat actor. There was a lot of conflating with Fin7. So we realized, you know what, there's actually two different groups. There's a pretty clean actor definition in Fin7. So let's create something there. But then there's this mess of everything else Carbonac. And so let's create a scenario on that. And so what we did was create two scenarios. One that would be based on Carbonac, the group at large, and one that was Fin7, both that leverage the Carbonac malware. But that way we're dealing now with more financial crimes. So it's a much more broad impact of a thing. Now we get to this past year where we announced Wizard, Spider, and Sandworm. This is the evaluations that are ongoing now to be released, hopefully at the end of Q1 or in early spring of this coming year. Wizard, Spider, and Sandworm is an interesting use case where we did a lot of research, a lot of debating, and then at the end of the day, we really decided, you know what, we need to focus on data encryption for impact. Around the time of last winter, when we were making this selection, ransomware was just all over the place. And so it was impacting people we knew. It was impacting the hospital chains, the education systems, and all these other things around. They were affecting our normal lives. And we're like, you know what, this is a public issue we need to do something around. And we can't just focus on exfil all the time. Let's focus on actually assessing the impact portion of attack. And let's focus on data encryption for impact. But you know what, data encryption for impact can be a couple different things. So in the case of Wizard Spider, we're talking about ransomware and the more traditional sense. But you know what? In Sandworm, they threw away the keys, and they were just doing it for disk wiping and to cripple the systems. They had no intentions of you being able to recover the data. And those are two different use cases that could have two different ways of executing those procedures. And we thought would be a nice kind of complementary perspective to this really important technique. And so that's how we got to the point of wanting to just do this data encryption. And you know what? In hindsight, it is a really great selection because last year was definitely the year of ransomware, or this past year has been the year of ransomware. When you consider the number of attacks that were happening, and the global response to it has been very interesting. So that's kind of led through the history of attack evaluations. At the end of the day, there's always some reason why we pick the adversaries we pick, right? There's always an educated decision behind it. In the early days, it was a lot of SME expertise going, hey, which groups would be a nice low bar and which groups would be a nice high bar, or which groups are kind of like the most prevalent in the news, those types of things. But as we've evolved, we've tried to be more scientific with our thinking and at least provide more variables and really debate which adversaries we're choosing each round, which led to the team having Cat last year. Cat just came into MITRE last year, and she was able to kind of provide us a lot of great options, even though at the end of the day, we put a little bit of an audible on her. But with that, I would like to twist it over to or turn it over to Kat so she can kind of go in with her thinking and how she approached the what adversary do I need to pick for this round.
So we actually have a couple of questions. I didn't know whether you wanted to think over those so they answer them now or in a little
We
bit.
can take an intermission now. So you probably have the questions up. So you want to ask?
So the first one is, when will you evaluate APT32 and their macOS TTPs?
So it's great because I actually got a question earlier about macOS too. So macOS is a very interesting surface, right? I think that the work that Kat is doing to plug her and Adam as well on the attack team is doing to bring to light the TTPs that exist on macOS and give attack for macOS a facelift. I think is really important to be able to do an evaluation on it, right? As things become reported, we can now create an adversary emulation that is actually, again, not just a hypothetical threat, but is a documented threat that we can emulate. So that's been one of the biggest limitations why we didn't go into even Linux until this last round was because the reporting, frankly, was not good enough. And fortunately, we've now gotten to the point where we've had a couple rounds of Linux. Mac OS has an additional complexity of the technology on where you can evaluate and how you can evaluate. So it's definitely on our roadmap. Kat wants to see it tomorrow. It's probably not going to be tomorrow, but it's definitely something that is on the forefront of our minds.
All right, the next question is there any way to use attack framework to forecast the next move for a cyber threat who has already compromised the network, perhaps as a function of the type of threat actor?
So that's a very interesting research problem. I would actually refer to center projects around flows that they're starting to talk about, and I think that you're going to see more and more on that. I was just on actually a panel discussion that made me miss the beginning of this conference, unfortunately. But there's a number of vendors who are all talking about their perspective to what I would consider flow analysis and trying to use it as more of a guiding principle to understand what else is happening in the networks because of what you have seen. So I do think that there's some good research in that space, but it's definitely not my research at this time.
All right. So that was all the questions I've seen. So I'll flip back.
Absolutely.
So the nice thing about what Frank said, I came on to MITRE last year and I was brand new. I had done emulation plans, but I hadn't done them at scale. I've done them for myself that I could then walk through, which, as we know, as red teamers, it's not nearly as formalized in these procedures and steps where we're having hundreds of thousands of eyes look over our work, and validate it or debate it or wonder about it or question it. So when I first got involved, I just wanted to understand, like, what does this work actually look like at scale, right? Because when you do something individually, it's a very different problem set than when you're doing it across an industry. So fortunately, I work with some incredible team members. I'm very blessed in that regard, where I have Jamie Williams and Mike Long and Frank and all of these different industry experts and like SMEs. Since we're not doing acronyms, we're doing words of acronyms. And I met with each one of them individually, and I was like, okay, what is it that you need? At what point do you need this? Like, at what level, what depth do you need this information? And what does that look like? And I reviewed the previous evaluations that we did. And then I would come back with my questions. I like, if you like, past Cat, thanks current Cat, and thanks current Mike and Jamie for all of the meetings that I had to make them sit through while I asked all these questions. And what I pulled out of that was I had a lot of different customers that needed a lot of different products. And this is very relevant because how do I define a threat actor that will actually be able to provide me all of these products at the end of the day? That was the real question that I was trying to answer. So, but first I had to know what was expected of me. So Frank had a certain problem set. He needed to be able to speak about the significance of a threat actor, right? Like, why do we care? That has to be asked and that has to be answered. Also, what techniques were actually covered? Does this actually have industry impact? I can't tell you how many conversations that we've had, just as he went over just a moment ago, about how does this drive the industry forward? Like, that's what we want to be able to speak to at the end of the day. Then I had another problem set where it was the development. So I would meet with Mike Long, who is our development lead. Okay, what do you need? Like, what does that look like? And we would go over code samples and technical reporting and diverse reporting, having a breakdown of that plan, knowing exactly what happens at each phase and having an overview of that scenario. And then also working with Jamie, who I got to understand a lot of, like, what was expected in the technique scope. What does that actually look like? And the coverage of that, and also the process of that, like what has to be done and what products are derived, what are my dependencies, right? Because you'll have one product that it's expected of you that has multiple dependencies. So what is the order of those? Which is a fun lesson to learn. So in the end, these were kind of my products, right? These were my deliverables, so to speak. And picking a threat actor for that was definitely tricky when I looked over what we'd previously done. So what I decided to do was make metrics. And what those metrics look like, they kind of boil down to 3 areas. One was industry significance, right? It needed to be significant to the industry, just as I just mentioned, right? The next one needed to be reporting coverage. Do I even have enough information to actually emulate this threat actor? Like, surprisingly enough, there was a lot of ones that were on our list to look into, but then the moment we started digging into these threat actors, there was only one vendor that reported on them, or there was only malware available and they were very loosely attributed, right? Like, there was a lot of different considerations to take into consideration when you're actually trying to emulate this from a technical perspective, not just from I'm writing a strategic report. The development complexity. This was very significant when we started going into, is everything in user land, or is it in kernel mode, or is this mostly around the network that we want to emulate this? Like, where does this technology live? And then do we have the skill sets to be able to represent this technology, right? Like, your team stack and your tech stack is going to be dependent upon this emulation. So all of those I pulled into metrics. And so my goal with this, right, because something that we talked about in our summary was the data points and then the phases of development. So the first phase was understanding what it is I needed. The second phase was then taking that and trying to drive something that I could have a number around my actual, like, can I do this? Like, is this actually an option? Because that was really the first, before we even decide who is actually qualified to be our villain in the story, right? Now, when I say villain, we're being very general just for the theme of it's a story. Like, we're not assigning good and bad to these people. Just want to clarify that for the theme. But I do need to know who's qualified to even be at this table first, right? Before we start going through this. So that's what I used. So the breakdown of those metrics is on the next slide. So this is very general. Everyone has a very different problem set. We all have different qualifiers for this. This just happens to be what I initially chose. This has kind of evolved over this last year as we put this into practice, because the one thing that I have truly found is that you can have a great idea, and then the moment you apply it, nothing goes as planned. So it's one of those that you just kind of like you can't future proof anything, right? Like the reality is like new reports will come out, new discoveries will come out, new problem sets, but you can prepare to the best of your ability and at least give yourself, like set yourself up for success. So that was really what I was hoping to do with this. So for those of you that are going through this yourselves, trying to find metrics around what would make a good adversary for you to be able to emulate, this is what we chose to do, just to be able to have some type of structure around it, just to make decisions, right? So first, we wanted reporting within the last 3 years. We wanted to be recent, right? We wanted that reporting to also be very diverse. We needed more than one vendor to be on it. So the gauge that we used, which has changed, which is why I'm not telling you guys what those numbers are, is because it's always in flux, right? Was we wanted a portion of that metric to be there's multiple vendors, right? It's not just FireEyes, it's not just CrowdStrikes, it's not just Trend Micro, right? There's different vendors that are all reporting the same thing, that are all actually for once in slight agreement as to who this is and the way that they conduct their operations and the malware that is also related to them, the infrastructure that is also related to them. We also needed technical reporting, specifically things that break down what the malware samples do. They explain the techniques. They explain why it's unique. That was always a really big thing, was actually having reporting, being able to break down at a code level. Why is this significant? And then also GitHub samples, right? Like different samples that were released or leaked, different GitHub code of other people that have actually already done the like reversing and then recreated the emulation on it. So that was kind of our metric for that guy. Then the next one, and you'll notice platform coverage is actually covered in both development complexity and industry value. So the development complexity was we wanted to be able to represent Linux and Windows. That is our current scoping. I really want it to be Mac OS. We are working on that. I'm like, I've got my fingers and all these other pies trying to make things happen to bring it eventually together. But right now it's Linux and Windows. So we really wanted to be able to have a decent representation on both of those systems. Another thing to take into consideration was the coding languages. We have a development team. So we need to know what coding language do we need to know in order to be able to recreate all of these software samples. Specialty skill sets. Are we dealing with the kernel? Are we dealing with the network? Are we going like where in the OSI model are we living and how much technical knowledge do we need? Can we just go into a little bit of assembly and then be able to jump right back up? Or do we have to like go full deep, like we're just playing with registers at this point and that's it? And the software availability. You laugh. It's a thing, Frank. I don't like assembly. Software availability, that was another thing. Like, is there even samples available, right? Like, is there even something available for us to be able to look at and then break down further? So that's development complexity, which Mike Long really helped with us. So a lot of times that was me working with Mike Long, be like, hey, here's what I've got. Like from your perspective, because you're in that mindset, like how complex do you think this would be? So he actually worked with me on creating that metric. And then industry value, this one is very hard to gauge, but what we looked at was the victims who the threat actors went after. What was the impact of that? Like at the end of the day, did they steal intellectual property and then do nothing with it? Or did they steal intellectual property and then leak it to everybody? Or did they steal all of these records and then disperse it to everybody? And then platform coverage again. Like we wanted to be able to, if you are like, there's a lot of different trends going on right now where it's, I'm going to use Google Docs and I'm also going to only have Mac OS platforms because they don't get viruses, right? Like we wanted to be able to have that kind of understanding of what coverage do we have for the industry. And so those are our 3 key metrics that we kind of used. Now, what that looks like is this. The next phase of this is bringing all the right people to the table. And what that looks like is being very intentional about who gets a decision, because we all have opinions, right? We all have valid opinions for a reason. In our case, we limited that to a couple of subject matter experts that have a very good ear in the community. which is actually what led us to pivot on some different decision points last year. And we have all the key stakeholders. So for us, that's going to be Frank and Mike and Jamie. And essentially, we need something to be able to have all the research done, and we have the metrics there, but we can talk at a high level. And so the first phase was basically like, here's everybody, right? Like, here's our plethora of people. Now, what do we really care about? And then we'd scope it down. And then the second phase was basically like, okay, now we've kind of got like a top 2, top 3. Now let's really look into it. And then we would have this slide in addition to a ton of notes about this threat actor that dive deeper so that we could pull some more meat. And then we would go through and essentially make decisions, right? Like, we wanted to have a good high level pros and cons list. So that way we knew what was the biggest bang for our buck in the end. Why do we care? Like, all of those points that I discussed earlier that like Frank needs to be able to speak to the industry about in public, like, we needed to have those front and center, because in the end, that's our North Star. Like, and by North Star, I mean, like, that is our I want to say like guardrail or guiding post, right? Like, that is the end of what we're trying to accomplish. So we always want to be in alignment with the real true goal, which is delivering impact to the actual industry and raising that tide. So this is the example of kind of what we came up with. You'll notice there's a column at the end called human factor. If you go to the next slide, turns out you can't account for this one. So little cat, new cat, had just gotten done with a great CTI course where we talked about bias and all of these things. And when we were having our meetings, I was like, okay, we're going to have a metrics driven meeting. This is going to be great. Like, I believe in this. So I've accounted for all these other metrics. And I really wanted to be able to like just drive it off of numbers. And so I was like, okay, we collected from all the team, like, okay, how bad do you want to emulate this actor? Or why, you know, like, what is your, like, if you ranked these guys, where do they rank? So we tried to take that all into account. Turns out in the end, like, the key stakeholders are there for a reason. They're there, like, our opinions as being in this industry are molded and crafted over time, and they're there for a reason, right? Like, we're very deep in the news, we're very deep in what's going on, we're very deep with like other subject matter experts and what they care about. So in the end, when we're picking which one we really want to go with, that factor is actually already accounted for. So you can't really account for it with the other ones, like, because that's basically what happened. We had a meeting and we had this like hierarchy ranked, and then we were like, but I just feel like it's this guy. Like, this is who we really should go with. And, you know, at the end of the day, it was the right decision. And it was the right decision because nothing will ever trump the fact that humans will always have this instinct to know what direction we're supposed to go. Like, data is great, AI is great, but in the end, there's a reason why we have these industry professionals here that we're putting our trust into. And that's kind of what it comes down to. So it was a great attempt to give us metrics because it created an environment that we could make an informed decision, which is really, in the end of the day, the point of all of this, right? We want to be able to have all of the information and feel confident in that information, but we're still going to make a decision based off of what we think is best.
Yeah, and just to layer on that, right, from my perspective, because I fully realize the pain Kat had when she's trying to bring science and math to this, and at the end of the day, we take a left turn and say, all right, you know what, we want to do data encryption for impact with two different groups instead of one group, and here we go. But from my perspective, right, we had always operated more from just like purely like this hunch, right? And even when Kat's articulating these are the different variables, this is how to dissect it, right? In Kat's first few months at MITRE, she was having this monumental impact on how we thought about things. The removing the unknown bias and just making it a bias, right? Being able to articulate, oh, you know what? Those things are the things that are in my head, right? Like, those are the things I'm considering. When we look at reporting, you know what? We take a very literal approach to adversary emulation, where we try to be very accurate in the way that our procedures hit, the data sources that we are hitting in the technologies. We take a very careful consideration for that. And so we have to make sure that the reporting we choose is reliable, right? Some vendors will be better for some, or some intel providers, let me put it that way. Some intel providers will be better at providing intel for specific threats versus certain other threats. And that's fine, but understanding the strengths and weaknesses of that reporting and the impact that that reporting has on our decision is of a huge value. Or being able to understand, you know what, this actor is really great. It would totally help level up the capabilities of vendors, but from a development perspective, we're going to spend a ton of money and a ton of time developing this thing, and at the end of the day, it's going to be for this one technique that's really interesting, right? That's not going to have the impact that we want. So to be able to understand the development complexity is super important, because me going back to my youth now, right? I would love to be doing assembly all the time, right? Like talking registers. That's why I started laughing, because like that stuff to me is like, I remember back in the day, I didn't ever want to be a software engineer or anything like that, because I just wanted to play with hardware all the time. And so part of me would love that, but it doesn't make any sense from a program like an attack evaluations perspective, because we don't have the skill set to be able to execute that. Nothing against the skill set that we do have, which is amazing. Or from like the industry value perspective, right? I mean, understanding the current industry landscape and what's needed. I mean, that's a hard thing in itself. So having Cat be able to try to articulate these different bins and then put in a few metrics to each of the bins was wildly helpful for us to kind of start thinking in this direction. And yeah, you might always have that squirrel moment and chasing the ball that's going by or whatever. Um, but that doesn't mean that all these other things aren't building up your knowledge of understanding, so that if I was in an organization, right, I could understand these are the different threats I need to emulate, and this is the different reasons why I need to emulate them. And so this type of structure is really good, and I look forward to kind of continuing down this path of trying to bring more science and math to the selection process and being open about that, so that hopefully you as an end user organization can understand, you know, what threats matter to me. Well, maybe it's along these lines. So just to kind of later on. So the bottom line is don't be intimidated by it, right? You need to know what matters to you at the end of the day. Follow that hunch, if it's follow that hunch of the human factor. Know what your requirements are. What are you trying to get at it? Are you trying to level up your capabilities, or are you trying to baseline them? Those are two very different adversaries that you would want to emulate. Or do you want to figure out which diverse one could emulate maybe both? Or are you specifically trying to hit a certain analytic? One of the interesting things that I always talk about is trying in the early days of attack, when we were doing our emulations, is trying to understand the what are the objectives. We developed this wonderful emulation plan, but at the end of the day, we didn't have a clear idea of the goals, and we completely missed them. So sure, we did our adversary emulation to the T, but at the end of the day, it didn't get us the data we needed, because we needed PowerShell to trigger, and we didn't choose PowerShell for whatever reason. So know what your goals are, know what your ambitions are, execute on those ambitions, and don't be scared by it. Right? There's this wealth of information that's out there. Don't get distracted by the shiny lights of the latest threat to come along the wire. Don't get enamored with them just because they're what everybody else is talking about. Think about what matters to you. What is going to be your threat, and try to address those. And the good news is there's a ton of community resources available that's really pushing this along. I mean, whether it's with the new MAD course, so that you can learn how to do it, or whether it's looking at all the repositories that are out there, right? I already mentioned the Center for Threat Informed Defense Adversary Emulation Plan Library, which, yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's a great resource to be able to try to consolidate at least the work that MITRE Ingenuity is doing in this vein, to be able to execute it, whether it's with a human red team and having that plan, or being able to have the YAML files that a Caldera or something could ingest. There's the Scythe libraries of the world. There's Attack IQ has plenty of libraries as well. All these different companies. There's the Atomic Red Team that even has this to a certain degree. There's a ton of public resources that allow you to diversify what you emulate, how you emulate it, and so forth. And so know that you're not alone. Know that you've got a ton of resources available to you, that you don't need to jump off the deep end into doing super sophisticated adversary emulation like an attack evaluations would, and that you can take your baby steps. But as long as you know your goals, you'll be able to ensure that adversary emulation is most usable by you. And so that's really what I want you going away with, is knowing that you can make it your own. And so obviously, thank you, and we can go no place like home now. But feel free to reach out. Attack Evaluations is driven by the community at the end of the day, right? The adversaries that we pick, we want to pick ones that are relevant to you. And by you, I mean the general public, right? And so you providing feedback of the things that interest you, right? The feedback that Mac OS is on the tip of somebody's tongue today is great, right? I mean, it's useful. Whether that will mean that we can do it next year or not, who knows? But it's at least a very useful data point that allows us to make more educated decisions, to ensure that what we deliver to you is always most applicable, that it's going to be usable, that it's going to be useful. And I would say that that's probably going to be the case with any of the MITRE engineering initiatives, in fact, that we're so collaborative. But feel free to reach out. Feel free to reach out to Kat, myself, or any of the rest of the team with more information on how you can get started with adversary emulation, or your use cases or your needs. But thank you very much for it.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to answer a quick question. It was maybe a misunderstanding, but what do you mean by the human factor? But can't you give a general persona to a different types of cyber threats? That is the difference between a nation state versus a script kiddie, etc. Yes. The way that we accounted for that was honestly with the we didn't fully factor in that aspect. The human factor was really about our team and like how bad do we what impact do we think the emulating this threat actor would be at? So if I wanted to emulate Wizard Spider and I thought that would drive the highest impact, I would give it a 5. But if I was like, I think Sandworm would be a higher impact than Wizard Spider, then I would actually rate Wizard Spider at a 4, and then I would rate or 3 or whatever I felt it would be at as far as impact goes, and then Sandworm at a 5. And then each one of us did that. So the human factor actually had nothing to do with the actual threat actor themselves, and more to do with what we felt was very impactful for the actual overall industry and kind of our gut instinct on why we thought we should emulate it. And that is it. But seriously, guys, I should say sorry, colloquialisms that I'm still working through that I grew up with. We really appreciate you all being here and taking the time to listen to us. And we, again, just as Frank said, we love to talk with different community members. We love the discussions, the debates, the curiosities, the just general talking points. So we can't wait to be able to talk to you outside of this, and we will be over in the booth shortly.
Since there's a minute left and a question just came in, I'm actually going to extend this. So we're going to say goodbye, do a question, then say goodbye, and then do another question, then say goodbye again for the third time. But the quick question that I'll have here is, do you think it would ever be possible to emulate villains who traverse multiple frameworks such as Enterprise, ICS, and how we see different vendors in each arena could be combined to provide holistic securities? So the bottom line is yeah, I think that would be super interesting. Obviously, that adds a world of complexity, but I do think that the community can get there in terms of being able to tie different actors together, right? Because a lot of these, well, not a lot of these actors, but there's a significant number of these actors that do cross these domains, right? Like to think of ICS, right? Take Colonial Pipelines, right? What was ICS in that? Well, it wasn't a whole lot of ICS. It could have been, though. And so it was the enterprise network that you can easily pivot over into the ICS one potentially. So I do think that there's some really interesting stories to be told there, and really interesting solutions to look at how they either get pieced together or whether it's the one solution that can look at both types of the domains. But I think that there's a lot of interesting there. And I think that as we get, again, more and more of the Intel stories to talk about how that pivot happens, that's what's going to be the driver for that. Because right now, I think a lot more is in the hypothetical domain versus the actual, though there are some points in time to talk about the actual too. But so I think we're got there, but it's going to be a walk before we do. All right. And with that, I'm going to drop. But I appreciate everyone's time. So goodbye for the third time. I really do mean it this time. And I really appreciate everyone's interest. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks, Frank and Kat. Terrific talk and great anecdotes there. Our next talk I'm going to be in, actually, it's the purple elephant in the room. We're going to be talking about purple teaming with a few of us who have had some experience there. So I will see you in that session.